My name is Georgina, and at 32 I thought I had built an unshakable career at Lancaster Innovations. For 5 years I poured my soul into that company, turning financial chaos into order and helping secure millions in funding. Then came that Friday when Madison, the founder's daughter, called me into her glass office. With a smirk that still burns in my memory, she chirped, "We do not keep slackers around here." Georgina, and just like that, I was fired. Little did she know that buried in my contract was a single clause that would be her undoing. Before I dive into how a few sentences in my exit paperwork brought down a multi-million-dollar company, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you will want to stick around for the moment when justice was finally served. Landing my position at Lancaster Innovations had felt like winning the lottery. After graduating with my finance degree, and spending 3 years at a stuffy accounting firm where creativity went to die, I was desperate for a change. I remember refreshing job boards during my lunch breaks, hoping for anything that would let me use my skills in a more meaningful way. The job listing for Lancaster Innovations caught my eye immediately. They needed someone to build their financial infrastructure from the ground up. A tech company specializing in smart home security systems, they had brilliant engineers, but struggled with the business side of things. The listing mentioned they were looking for someone who could translate innovation into sustainable growth. It felt like it was written specifically for me. My interview with Harold Lancaster himself solidified my desire to work there. Harold was in his early 60s then, with silver hair and the kind of energy you would expect from someone half his age. He had built the company from his garage, developing the first prototype of their signature security system when his own home had been broken into. There was something magnetic about his passion, the way he spoke about not just making money, but making people feel safe. "Georgina," he said, leaning forward in his chair after I had walked him through my ideas for their financial structure. "Most people I interview just tell me what they think I want to hear. You are actually telling me what I need to hear." That was the beginning of what I thought would be the career of a lifetime. The Lancaster Innovations office was nothing like the sterile accounting firm I had come from. The converted warehouse space buzzed with creativity. Engineers huddled around workstations, marketing people brainstormed on whiteboards, and there was an actual ping-pong table that people actually used. It was exactly the environment I had been craving. My first few months were a whirlwind of setting up proper accounting systems, creating financial forecasts, and establishing relationships with potential investors. Harold gave me surprising autonomy, only stepping in to provide guidance when I asked for it. "I did not hire you to micromanage you," he would say. "I hired you because you know things I do not know." It was during this time that I became close with Amelia from the marketing department and Jacob from legal. The three of us often stayed late, ordering takeout and helping each other with various projects. Amelia was brilliant at translating technical specifications into benefits that customers actually cared about, while Jacob had a knack for making complicated legal language understandable to the rest of us. As for my role, I quickly discovered I had a talent for telling the company's financial story in a way that excited investors. In the first year alone, I helped secure $3 million in funding, allowing us to expand our product line and hire more engineers. It was after that successful funding round that Harold called me into his office for a meeting that would later prove to be incredibly significant. He wanted to promote me to financial director, which came with a substantial raise in equity in the company. "Before you sign this contract," Harold said, sliding the document across his desk, "I want to draw your attention to something special I have included." He flipped to page 3 and pointed to a clause that seemed unusual. It was labeled Ethical Management Protection. "This clause is in every senior staff contract," Harold explained. "It states that if you are ever terminated, you have the right to address the board directly if you believe the termination was due to raising concerns about ethical violations or financial improprieties. I never want anyone in this company to feel they cannot speak up if something is wrong." At the time, I thought it was just another example of Harold's integrity. I never imagined I would need to invoke that clause. The company was growing rapidly, our products were winning industry awards, and I was part of a team that felt more like family than colleagues. Within 3 years of joining Lancaster Innovations, we had grown from a company of 20 employees to over 100. Our security systems were now in thousands of homes across the country, and we were beginning to expand internationally. Harold's vision was becoming reality, and I took pride in knowing I was helping build something meaningful. Life was good. I had bought my first condo, made friends I genuinely cared about, and felt challenged and respected in my work. Madison Lancaster was just a name I occasionally heard mentioned. Harold's daughter, who was finishing her MBA at Wharton. I had no idea how drastically things would change once she entered the picture. The first sign that something was changing came about 4 years into my time at Lancaster Innovations. Harold called an all-staff meeting, something he rarely did, unless there was significant news to share. Standing at the front of our largest conference room, he looked slightly paler than usual, his customary energy somewhat dimmed. "I wanted to let you all know that I have been dealing with some health issues," he announced, his voice still strong despite the concerning news. "Nothing to panic about, but my doctors are insisting I reduce my workload. To that end, I am bringing my daughter Madison on board to help with day-to-day operations while I focus on treatment and recovery." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Most of us had never met Madison, though we knew she existed. Harold had occasionally mentioned how proud he was of her academic achievements, but she had never shown interest in the company before. Madison made her first appearance the following Monday. At 28, she was striking with her perfectly highlighted blonde hair, designer clothes, and the confident stride of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. She had Harold's height, but none of his warmth, greeting everyone with practiced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. "I am so excited to finally be joining the Lancaster family business," she announced in her first department meeting. "I have so many fresh ideas from my time at Wharton that I cannot wait to implement." Those fresh ideas started small. First, it was changing our casual dress code to something more corporate. Then came a new time tracking system that felt unnecessarily punitive. Team lunches, which had been a company tradition, were deemed inefficient. One by one, the elements that had made Lancaster Innovations special began to disappear. Harold's presence in the office became increasingly rare as his health issues continued. When he did come in, he seemed distracted, often deferring to Madison on decisions he would have previously made himself. It was clear his energy was focused on his health, as it should have been, but the power vacuum he left was quickly filled by his daughter. About 2 months after Madison's arrival, she hired 4 of her business school friends into senior positions. Suddenly, there was a new marketing director positioned above Amelia, a new operations chief who knew nothing about our products, and a strategy consultant named Parker, who seemed to exist solely to agree with Madison's ideas. My first direct conflict with Madison came during the annual company retreat. We had rented a lakeside conference center, and I was scheduled to present our financial projections for the coming year. I had spent weeks preparing, ensuring my numbers were solid, and my presentation was clear. 10 minutes before I was set to present, Madison approached me. "I will be handling the financial presentation," she informed me, not asked me. "Excuse me," I replied, caught completely off guard. "I have been working on this for weeks. The team is expecting to hear from me." Madison's smile tightened. "Yes, well, as the founder's daughter and someone with an MBA in finance, I think I am better positioned to present these numbers. Besides, you look tired, Georgina. Have you been slacking on your sleep?" That comment, so casually cruel, was my first glimpse of what was to come. She took my presentation file, walked to the front of the room, and proceeded to present my work as her own. Even worse, she altered some of my projections on the fly, making promises to the team that I knew we could not keep. When I tried to speak to Harold about the incident afterward, his assistant informed me he was taking time off for medical treatments, and all business matters should be directed to Madison. It was becoming clear that the company I had helped build was slipping away. The following months saw a gradual but unmistakable shift in the company culture. People who had once collaborated freely now guarded their work. The open-door policy Harold had championed was replaced with formal meeting requests and strict hierarchies. Longtime employees began updating their resumes, and several left for other opportunities. Jacob from legal pulled me aside after one particularly tense executive meeting. "Something is not right with the direction we are heading," he whispered. "Madison is making decisions that seem designed to pump up short-term numbers at the expense of long-term stability." I had noticed the same thing. Our product quality was suffering as Madison pushed for faster release cycles. Customer complaints were rising, but the focus had shifted from solving problems to managing perceptions. Through it all, I tried to remain loyal to Harold's vision. I still believed in what Lancaster Innovations could be, even as I watched it transform into something I hardly recognized. I just needed to weather the storm until Harold returned to full health and saw what was happening to his company. I did not know then that the storm was just beginning, and that I would soon find myself at its center. The systematic dismantling of my position within the company began with what seemed like small administrative changes. First, Madison reorganized the reporting structure so that instead of reporting directly to the CEO as I had done with Harold, I now reported to Parker, her business school friend, who had been given the vague title of Chief Strategy Officer. This extra layer of management meant my financial analyses and concerns now had to go through Parker before reaching any decision-makers. "It is nothing personal," Madison assured me with her practiced smile when I questioned the change. "We are just creating a more streamlined organization. Parker has a broader view of our strategy, so it makes sense for you to report to him." What it actually meant was that any financial concerns I raised could be easily buried. When I presented a detailed analysis showing that our new pricing structure was alienating our core customers, Parker simply nodded, thanked me for my input, and never passed it along. The next blow came during our quarterly planning session. For years, I had managed the company's relationships with our major investors, providing them with transparent updates and building trust. Madison announced that investor relations would now be handled by the newly expanded PR department. "Georgina is so valuable in her number-crunching role," she explained to the team. "We should not distract her with these external relationships." Number-crunching, as if my role had been reduced to that of a human calculator. The investors I had carefully cultivated relationships with were now being fed polished narratives instead of honest assessments. I tried calling several of them directly to maintain the connections, only to receive an email from Madison reminding me that all investor communications needed to go through proper channels. Then came the Bradford account incident. Bradford Technologies was a potential client I had been courting for months. They were looking to integrate our security systems into their smart building infrastructure, a deal that could have been worth millions. After countless meetings, proposal revisions, and relationship building, they were finally ready to sign. The morning of the contract signing, Madison called me into her office. "Great news," she said, not looking up from her computer. "Blake will be taking over the Bradford account. You can forward all your notes and contacts to him." Blake was yet another Wharton graduate hired just 2 weeks prior, with zero knowledge of our products or the Bradford negotiations. "That makes no sense," I protested. "I've been working with their team for months. They're expecting me at the signing today." Madison finally looked up. "Blake has extensive experience in the commercial sector from his summer internship. Besides, we need a fresh approach with Bradford. Your numbers were too conservative on the growth projections." "Because those are the realistic numbers," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "Bradford specifically appreciated our honesty about timeline and costs. If you change those now..." "That will be all," Georgina. Madison cut me off. "Please transfer your files to Blake immediately." I later learned from my contact at Bradford that they pulled out of the deal after Blake presented them with wildly unrealistic promises and altered terms. A multi-million-dollar opportunity lost because Madison could not bear to let me succeed. The isolation grew worse as colleagues began avoiding me in meetings and the break room. People who had once been friends now kept their distance, likely fearing association with someone who was clearly falling out of favor with the new leadership. Lunch invitations stopped. My input in meetings was increasingly ignored or dismissed. It was during this difficult period that I discovered something truly concerning. While preparing the quarterly financial report, I noticed discrepancies in several accounts. Expenses were being miscategorized, revenue was being recognized earlier than accounting standards allowed, and there were transactions with vague descriptions flowing to entities I did not recognize. When I brought these issues to Parker, he dismissed them as reclassifications for tax purposes and said Madison had approved them all. I knew enough about accounting practices to recognize that what I was seeing went beyond aggressive accounting and into potentially fraudulent territory. I tried emailing Harold directly outlining my concerns in careful, objective language. I received a reply not from Harold, but from his assistant, saying he was focused on his health and all financial matters should be directed to Madison. With growing unease, I began documenting everything. I saved emails, took screenshots of accounting entries before they were changed, and kept detailed notes of every concerning interaction. I remembered that clause in my contract, the ethical management protection that Harold had included, and hoped I would never need to use it. The emotional toll was immense. I started having trouble sleeping, constantly replaying interactions, and wondering what I could have done differently. My friends outside of work noticed the change in me, how I had become withdrawn and anxious. One night, after canceling dinner plans for the third time, My friend Samantha confronted me. "What is happening with you, Georgina?" she asked over the phone. "You used to love your job and now you sound miserable every time you mention work." "I am just going through a rough patch," I said, not wanting to unload all my problems on her. "Things will get better once Harold comes back." But I was beginning to doubt that myself. The latest rumor around the office was that Harold's condition was more serious than initially disclosed, and Madison was positioning herself for a permanent leadership role. The final humiliation came during the quarterly all-hands meeting. Madison had instituted a new practice of publicly reviewing each department's performance. When she got to finance, she put up a slide showing missed targets and inefficiencies, all carefully framed to make my department look incompetent. "As you can see," she said to the room of over 100 employees, "our financial planning has been falling short. We need more accurate forecasting and better cost control." She looked directly at me. "Georgina, we will need to see significant improvement in the next quarter." What she failed to mention was that the targets had been missed because she had overridden my original realistic projections with her own inflated numbers, or that the inefficiencies were largely due to the chaotic reorganizations she had implemented. As I sat there, feeling the eyes of my colleagues on me, I made a decision. I would not resign. I would not give Madison the satisfaction of breaking me. I would continue documenting the irregularities, protecting Harold's company in his absence, and hope that truth would eventually prevail. I had no idea that the confrontation would come sooner and more dramatically than I could have imagined. The morning of my firing began like any other day. I arrived at the office at 7:30, a full hour before most employees, to review some concerning transactions I had discovered the previous evening. There had been a series of payments to a consulting firm called TW Enterprises that I could find no record of us actually working with. The amounts were just under the threshold that would require additional approval, a common tactic in financial fraud. I was so engrossed in my investigation that I did not notice Madison approaching my desk until she was standing right beside me. I quickly switched to a different screen, but from her expression, I wondered if she had seen what I was reviewing. "Georgina, I need to see you in my office." "Now," she said, her voice clipped and cold. As I followed her through the open workspace, I noticed several executive team members were already gathered in her glass-walled office. Parker was there, along with Blake and Rachel from HR. My stomach tightened with dread. Once inside, Madison gestured for me to sit in the single chair, positioned in front of her desk, while the others remained standing, forming an intimidating semicircle behind me. "Georgina, we have been monitoring your performance for some time now, and frankly, it has been disappointing." Madison began, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this speech. "You have consistently missed targets, failed to adapt to our new direction, and your negative attitude is affecting team morale." Each accusation felt like a physical blow. These were not just distortions of reality, they were complete fabrications. "With all due respect," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "the targets I supposedly missed were changed after I set them. I have documented evidence of this, and I have always conducted myself professionally, despite the challenges." Madison's eyes narrowed slightly, the only crack in her polished facade. "We do not need to make this difficult. The fact is, your performance is not meeting our standards." She slid a folder across the desk. "We are terminating your employment effective immediately. Rachel will walk you through the severance details." "On what grounds exactly?" I asked, not touching the folder. That is when Madison delivered the line that would later prove so ironic. Leaning forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes, she said, "We do not keep slackers around here, Georgina. Lancaster Innovations needs people who are committed to our vision and can keep up with our pace. You are clearly not that person anymore." Slacker. After 5 years of dedicated service, after all the late nights and weekends, after building their financial systems from nothing, she had the audacity to call me a slacker. The shock must have shown on my face because Parker stepped forward, assuming the role of good cop. "Look, Georgina, sometimes it is just not a good fit. The company is moving in a new direction, and we need to make tough decisions." I sat in stunned silence as Rachel explained that I would receive 2 weeks of severance pay, that my company email would be deactivated immediately, and that I would need to collect my personal belongings under supervision. Blake, who had been silent until now, held out a box. "For your things," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. As I rose from the chair, a strange calm settled over me. I had prepared for this possibility, backing up documentation of the financial irregularities to my personal email and keeping copies of key communications. I will need time to properly transition my projects, I said, knowing full well they would refuse. That will not be necessary, Madison replied coldly. Blake will be taking over your responsibilities. Blake, who had never worked in finance a day in his life. Blake, who had tanked the Bradford deal with his incompetence. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 2 security guards were waiting outside Madison's office, a humiliating escort for someone who had helped build this company. As I packed my desk with trembling hands, I could feel the eyes of my colleagues. Some looked away in discomfort, others watched with unconcealed curiosity, and a few, like Amelia, had expressions of genuine concern. Amelia tried to approach me, but one of the guards stepped between us. No communication with staff, he said gruffly. The walk out of the building carrying my small box of personal items between the 2 guards was the longest of my life. With each step, I felt the weight of injustice growing heavier. This was not just about losing my job. It was about watching something I'd helped build being corrupted from within. Outside, the bright morning sunshine felt like a mockery of my dark mood. I sat in my car for several minutes, too shaken to drive when my phone pinged with a text message from an unknown number. This is Jacob from Legal. They do not know I have your personal number. Whatever you do, review your contract carefully before signing anything. Call me when you can talk privately. Before I could respond, another message arrived, this time an email from Lancaster Innovations. It was from Sandra, the company counsel, requesting that I come to the office the next morning to finalize my exit paperwork. Standard procedure, the email read. We will need your signature on several documents, including confidentiality agreements and your acknowledgement of separation terms. I replied that I would be there, my mind already working through what I would need to do to prepare. That night, I barely slept reviewing my contract, repeatedly paying particular attention to the ethical management protection clause Harold had specifically pointed out years ago. The next morning, I arrived at Lancaster dressed in my most professional outfit, a subtle armor against what I knew would be another difficult encounter. I was escorted directly to a small conference room where Sandra waited with a thick folder of documents. Thank you for coming in, Georgina, she said, her expression professionally neutral. We just need you to sign these standard separation agreements. I took the folder and began reading each document carefully, much to Sandra's visible impatience. When I reached the severance agreement, I noticed something immediately. This offers 2 weeks of severance, I said. My contract guarantees 4 weeks for each year of service. I have been here 5 years, so I should receive 20 weeks. Sandra looked uncomfortable. I will have to check on that. Let us move on to the non-disclosure agreement for now. I continued methodically through each document, taking notes when necessary. I could tell Sandra was growing increasingly uneasy with my thoroughness. Most employees, shell-shocked after being fired, simply signed whatever was put in front of them. I was not going to make that mistake. When we finally reached the last document, I signed it with a steady hand, making sure not to draw attention to the fact that the ethical management protection clause was still intact. Either Madison had been too careless to check, or she had never known about it in the first place. As I handed back the signed documents, I felt a strange sense of power returning. Madison thought she had won by firing me, but she had just set in motion events that would ultimately be her undoing. The board meeting was scheduled for the following day, and thanks to Harold's foresight years ago, I had every right to be there. The moment I got home from signing the exit paperwork, I spread all my documents across my dining room table and got to work. First, I needed to thoroughly understand exactly what the ethical management protection clause entitled me to. The language was clear: if terminated, I had the right to address the board directly at the next board meeting if I believed the termination was related to raising concerns about ethical violations or financial improprieties. I had never attended a board meeting before. They happened quarterly, and Harold had always represented the executive team. I knew the current board consisted of Harold, Madison, 2 early investors, named Richard and Thomas, and an independent member, Dr. Eleanor Wright, who had been Harold's mentor at university. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jacob calling from a coffee shop near the office. I cannot talk long, he said, his voice low despite being away from the office. But you need to know what is happening. Madison is planning to present a completely restructured financial forecast at tomorrow's board meeting. She is painting a picture that makes it look like you are hiding problems, and that she discovered and fixed them after firing you. My blood boiled at the injustice. She cannot possibly get away with that. The numbers will tell the real story. That is the thing, Jacob continued. She has had Blake reworking all the financial statements for the past month. They are going to show revised historical data that makes previous quarters look worse than they were, so the current quarter seems like a miraculous improvement. This was worse than I had imagined. They were not just firing me to cover up their questionable practices. They were actively falsifying company records to make themselves look like heroes. The board meeting is tomorrow at 9, Jacob added. Eleanor Wright has been asking questions about your departure. She seemed surprised when she heard you were fired. That was interesting. Eleanor had always been known for her integrity. If anyone on the board would be receptive to the truth, it would be her. After hanging up with Jacob, I dove into my research with renewed purpose. I pulled up Lancaster Innovations' public financial statements from the past several quarters. As a private company, they did not have to disclose everything, but there was still plenty of information available. I began creating a detailed timeline of when the financial irregularities started, noticing they coincided perfectly with Madison's increased influence. I compiled a list of the suspicious payments to TW Enterprises and discovered through some careful internet research that the company was registered to Thomas Walsh, a college friend of Madison's, who did not appear to provide any actual services to Lancaster. Next, I analyzed the customer complaint data that Amelia had been quietly sending me over the past months. There was a clear correlation between the decline in product quality and the cost-cutting measures Madison had implemented. Our once loyal customer base was eroding rapidly, with cancellation rates triple what they had been a year ago. By midnight, my dining room looked like a scene from a detective movie, with papers, sticky notes, and my laptop displaying spreadsheets and corporate governance regulations. I had created a comprehensive presentation that documented not just the financial irregularities, but the systematic dismantling of the company culture and practices that had made Lancaster Innovations successful in the first place. But as I sat back, rubbing my tired eyes, a wave of doubt washed over me. Was I doing the right thing? Exposing these problems could potentially damage the company Harold had built. Employees could lose their jobs if investors pulled out. Was my desire for justice clouding my judgment? I decided to call the one person whose opinion I trusted implicitly, my former mentor from my accounting firm days, Diana. You are not just doing this for yourself, Diana reassured me after I explained the situation. This is about protecting the company from someone who is actively harming it. Harold created that clause specifically for situations like this. He would want you to use it. She was right. This was not about revenge. It was about upholding the ethical standards Harold had instilled in the company. It was about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. With renewed determination, I finalized my presentation, making sure every claim was backed by solid evidence. I then drafted a concise statement explaining why I was invoking the Ethical Management Protection Clause, being careful to focus on the facts rather than emotions. My last task was to reach out to Eleanor Wright. Finding her contact information was not easy, but through some creative searching on professional networks, I managed to get her email address. I sent her a brief, professional message. Dr. Wright, my name is Georgina, former financial director at Lancaster Innovations. I will be attending tomorrow's board meeting under the Ethical Management Protection Clause in my contract to address some serious concerns about the company's financial practices. Given your reputation for integrity, I wanted to give you advance notice. I believe Harold would want you to hear what I have to say. I did not expect a response, so I was surprised when my email pinged just 20 minutes later. Miss Georgina, I have been concerned about recent changes at Lancaster. I look forward to hearing your perspective tomorrow. Please come prepared with documentation. Thank you for your courage. Dr. Eleanor Wright. That short message gave me the final boost of confidence I needed. Someone on the board was already questioning Madison's leadership. I would not be walking into the meeting completely alone. I spent the rest of the night rehearsing my presentation, anticipating questions or challenges that might arise, and making sure my evidence was ironclad. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but ready. As I showered and dressed in my most professional outfit, I thought about Harold and how disappointed he would be to see what had happened to his company. I thought about Amelia, Jacob, and all the other dedicated employees who deserved better leadership. And I thought about Madison, who had so casually dismissed me as a slacker, unaware that I was about to become her biggest problem. The company's legal counsel had never explicitly told me not to attend the board meeting, Perhaps they had forgotten about the clause, or perhaps Madison had never bothered to fully review my contract before firing me. Either way, their oversight was about to cost them dearly. With my presentation loaded on my laptop and a folder of supporting documents in my bag, I got into my car and drove toward Lancaster Innovations for what I hoped would be the last time, but for all the right reasons. The Lancaster Innovations headquarters looked different as I approached it that morning. What had once felt like a second home now loomed before me like a fortress I needed to breach. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when he saw me. "Miss Georgina," I thought. "We're not you." "I am here for the board meeting," I said, with more confidence than I felt placing my still active access card on his desk. They had deactivated my email but forgotten to deactivate my building access. Another oversight that worked in my favor. "I will need to call up for clearance," he said, reaching for his phone. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Please let them know I am here under Article 7, Section 3 of my employment contract, the Ethical Management Protection Clause." He relayed the message, his expression growing confused at the response he received. "Someone is coming down to escort you," he finally said. Minutes later, Sandra appeared, her usually composed face tight with tension. "Georgina, the board meeting is a closed session. I do not understand why you think you can attend." I handed her a printed copy of my contract, the relevant clause highlighted. "As you can see, I have the right to address the board regarding ethical concerns following my termination. The clause is still binding as part of my exit agreement, which I signed yesterday in your presence." Sandra skimmed the document, her face paling slightly. "I will need to discuss this with the board." "The clause does not require prior board approval," I pointed out. "It specifically states that the terminated employee has the right to attend the next scheduled board meeting, which is happening right now." After a tense moment of silence, Sandra nodded stiffly. "Follow me." As we walked toward the executive conference room, I could feel my heart pounding. Everything hinged on the next hour. Sandra opened the door, and all conversation inside immediately ceased. The boardroom was smaller than I had imagined, with a gleaming oval table surrounded by plush chairs. Harold sat at the head of the table, looking thinner than I remembered with Madison beside him. Richard and Thomas, the investors, sat opposite them with Dr. Eleanor Wright at the far end. Blake hovered near a sideboard with refreshments, clearly not a board member, but there to present the financial data. "What is she doing here?" Madison demanded, standing up abruptly. Harold looked confused, but not angry. "Georgina, I heard you had left the company." Before I could speak, Sandra cleared her throat. "Miss Georgina is invoking Article 7, Section 3 of her employment contract, the Ethical Management Protection Clause." "The what?" Madison snapped. Harold's expression changed from confusion to understanding. "The clause I put in all senior contracts," he said quietly. "If they believe they were terminated for raising ethical concerns, they have the right to address the board." "That is ridiculous," Madison protested. "She was fired for poor performance." Dr. Wright leaned forward. "I believe we should hear what Miss Georgina has to say. That clause exists for a reason." Madison looked like she wanted to argue further, but Harold raised a hand. "Madison, please, let us follow proper procedure." He turned to me. "Georgina, please take a seat. You will have the floor after we complete the standard opening business." I sat in an empty chair near Dr. Wright, feeling Madison's glare like a physical force. The board quickly moved through approval of previous minutes and a brief update on Harold's health, which seemed to be improving. Then Sandra, who was taking minutes, said next on the agenda is the formal recognition of Georgina's termination. "I have the exit paperwork here for the record." She began reading the standard language about my separation from the company, listing the official reasons for termination that Madison had fabricated. I watched the board members' faces, noting Richard and Thomas's disinterest, and Dr. Wright's growing frown. Then, Sandra reached the section that contained the Ethical Management Protection Acknowledgement. She hesitated, clearly seeing it for the first time. "It says here that the employee retains the right to address the board regarding any ethical concerns." Madison interrupted. "Just skip to the signature section, Sandra. We do not need to read every bit of boilerplate." "Actually," Harold said, reaching for the document, "I would like to see that." He took the paperwork from Sandra and read silently, his expression darkening. Then he looked up at Madison. "Did you know about this clause when you fired Georgina?" Madison's confident facade faltered slightly. I do not micromanage the legal department. If it was in her contract, it was one of dozens of standard provisions. It was not standard, Harold replied. I personally added it to protect our executives from exactly this kind of situation. He turned to me. Georgina, you have the floor. Taking a deep breath, I connected my laptop to the room's display system. Thank you, Mr. Lancaster. Board members, I am here today because I believe I was terminated for attempting to address serious financial improprieties and ethical violations that have occurred at Lancaster Innovations over the past year. Madison scoffed, but Harold silenced her with a look. I began my presentation with a timeline of when the questionable practices began perfectly correlating with Madison's increased control. I showed evidence of the suspicious payments to TW Enterprises, revealing its connection to Madison's friend. I presented before and after examples of financial statements that had been retroactively altered to make previous performance look worse than it was. As you can see, I explained, displaying a particularly damning comparison, these numbers were changed after the fact to create the illusion of a turnaround under the new leadership. Richard, one of the investors, leaned forward with a frown. Are you suggesting these financial statements we have been receiving are fraudulent? I am presenting evidence that they have been manipulated to tell a specific narrative, I replied carefully. Whether that constitutes fraud would be a legal determination. I continued with data, showing the decline in product quality and customer satisfaction, the exodus of experienced employees, and the pattern of replacing them with inexperienced friends of Madison. Throughout my presentation, I kept my tone professional and fact-based, letting the evidence speak for itself. Madison attempted to interrupt several times, but each time either Harold or Dr. Wright asked her to allow me to finish. When I reached the section about the Bradford deal, Thomas, the other investor, actually cursed under his breath. We were told that client backed out because they found a cheaper alternative. They backed out. I clarified because after I was removed from the negotiations, they were suddenly presented with unrealistic promises and altered terms. By the time I finished my 30-minute presentation, the room had fallen into a stunned silence. Even Blake, who had been standing nervously by the refreshments, looked shaken. Madison was the first to recover. This is absurd. She has clearly manipulated this data out of spite after being rightfully terminated. Blake, show them our actual financials. Blake stepped forward hesitantly, but Harold raised his hand. Before we move on, I have some questions for Georgina. What followed was an intense questioning session from all board members. I answered each query with facts referring to specific documents and data points. When asked how I had access to some of this information after being fired, I explained that I had documented these issues while still employed, concerned about exactly this scenario. Dr. Wright was particularly focused on the customer satisfaction metrics. So you are saying our return rate has tripled. Why were we not informed of this? That data was recategorized in reports to the board, I explained. Returns were labeled as product exchanges, which technically did not count in the return metrics. As the questioning wound down, Harold turned to Madison, his expression a mixture of disappointment and anger. Do you have anything to say about these allegations? Madison's composed demeanor had cracked considerably. Daddy, you cannot possibly believe this. She is clearly trying to sabotage me because she could not adapt to my leadership style. Yes, I brought in people I trust. Yes, I made changes to how we present data, but everything I have done has been to strengthen this company, your company. By falsifying financial statements, Richard asked incredulously. By driving away our best client prospects, by replacing experienced staff with your friends from business school. We needed fresh perspectives, Madison insisted, but her argument sounded hollow even to my ears. Harold rubbed his temples, looking suddenly much older. Sandra, please ask Blake to wait outside. And Madison, I think it would be best if you stepped out as well while the board discusses this matter. You cannot be serious, Madison protested. I am a board member. I have every right to be part of this discussion. You are also the subject of very serious allegations, Dr. Wright pointed out. It would be a conflict of interest for you to participate in this deliberation. After a tense standoff, Madison finally stormed out with Blake trailing behind her like a lost puppy. The moment the door closed, Harold turned to me. Georgina, I owe you an apology. I was so focused on my health that I failed to see what was happening to my company. Thank you for having the courage to bring this to our attention. What happens now? I asked. Richard, the more outspoken of the investors, was direct. If even half of what you have presented is accurate, we have a serious governance problem. I move that we suspend Madison from all operational duties, pending a full investigation by an independent auditor. The vote was unanimous, with Harold recusing himself but clearly supporting the decision. Thomas was tasked with informing Madison, while Dr. Wright asked if I would be willing to assist the external auditors in their investigation. As the meeting adjourned, Harold asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, he looked at me with genuine regret. When I created that clause, I never imagined it would be needed because of my own daughter, he said quietly. I am deeply sorry for what you have endured, Georgina. I did not want to hurt you, or the company, I told him honestly. I just could not stand by and watch everything you built be dismantled by unethical practices. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Would you consider coming back? We are going to need someone with your expertise to help clean up this mess. I promised to think about it, though I was not sure I could return after everything that had happened. As I walked out of the boardroom, I saw Madison being escorted to her office by security to collect her personal items, the same humiliating exit she had forced on me days earlier. Our eyes met briefly across the hallway. The shock and fury in her expression made it clear she had never imagined this outcome when she decided to fire the slacker who had been quietly documenting her every misstep. In the weeks following that momentous board meeting, Lancaster Innovations underwent a profound transformation. The board immediately hired an external auditing firm to conduct a thorough investigation, and I agreed to work with them as a consultant, helping them navigate the complex web of financial manipulations that Madison had implemented. The findings were even worse than I had initially presented. The auditors discovered that TW Enterprises, owned by Madison's friend Thomas Walsh, had received over $500,000 for consulting services that were never actually provided. They found evidence that Madison had been planning to sell off the company's most valuable patents to a shell company, effectively stripping Lancaster Innovations of its core intellectual property before potentially taking it public at an inflated valuation. Harold called me personally when the final audit report was delivered. His voice sounded stronger than it had in months. I never imagined my own daughter could do something like this, he said, the pain evident in his words. The doctors say the stress of discovering all this has actually set back my recovery, but I needed to know the truth. Madison faced serious consequences for her actions. The board referred the financial misappropriation to the authorities, and she was barred from any future role at the company. Her business school friends who had been placed in executive positions were all removed, though Blake, who had mostly been a pawn in her schemes, was reassigned to a more appropriate entry-level position after cooperating fully with the 2007 investigation. 3 weeks after the board meeting, Harold invited me to lunch at his favorite restaurant near the office. As we settled into our booth, I noticed he looked more like his old self, some of the vigor returning to his eyes. Georgina, I want to formally offer you your job back, he said after we had ordered. In fact, I would like to promote you to Chief Financial Officer. The board unanimously approved the appointment this morning. The offer was tempting. Despite everything that had happened, I still cared deeply about Lancaster Innovations and its potential. But the experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I am honored by the offer, Harold, truly. But I need to think about whether returning is the right move for me. The past few months have been incredibly difficult. Harold nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. The position is yours whenever you want it. In the meantime, would you at least consider continuing as a consultant during the transition? We are bringing back several key employees who left during Madison's tenure, and your guidance would be invaluable. I agreed to that arrangement, which gave me the flexibility to process everything while still helping to rebuild what Madison had nearly destroyed. Working part-time for Lancaster also gave me space to pursue a new passion that had emerged from this experience: corporate governance and ethics training. I began developing a program to help companies establish better safeguards against the kind of takeover Madison had executed. The media eventually got wind of the story, though the company managed to control the narrative by being transparent about what had happened and the steps being taken to correct it. Industry publications praised Harold for the ethical management protection clause that had ultimately saved his company, and several other tech firms began implementing similar provisions in their executive contracts. As for my colleagues, the changes were bittersweet. Amelia was promoted to marketing director, the position she had deserved all along. Jacob received recognition for his quiet resistance during Madison's reign. But many good people had left during the dark period, their trust broken beyond repair. One rainy afternoon, about 6 months after the board meeting, I was having coffee with Amelia when she asked the question I had been asking myself. "Do you regret not speaking up sooner, before things got so bad?" I considered this carefully. "I regret not trusting my instincts earlier," I finally replied. I kept hoping Harold would return and fix everything instead of taking action myself. But I also know that without solid evidence, I would have just been another disgruntled employee making accusations. "You saved the company," Amelia said simply. "Not many people would have had the courage to do what you did." After much reflection, I ultimately declined the CFO position at Lancaster. Instead, I started my own consulting firm, specializing in financial ethics and corporate governance, with Lancaster Innovations as my first client. Harold was disappointed but supportive, even becoming an investor in my new venture. The experience taught me valuable lessons that I carry with me every day. I learned that integrity is not just a personal virtue but a professional responsibility. I discovered that documentation is power, especially when facing those who would abuse their authority. Most importantly, I realized that sometimes being loyal to a company's values means standing against those who would corrupt them, even when it comes at personal cost. Harold's health eventually improved enough for him to return to a more active role at Lancaster. Under his renewed leadership, the company slowly regained its innovative spirit and ethical foundation. The security systems that had been compromised under Madison's cost-cutting measures were redesigned with a focus on quality, and customer satisfaction scores began to climb again. As for Madison, I heard through industry connections that she had moved across the country, unable to find work in our field after what had happened. Part of me felt sorry for her, but a larger part recognized that accountability is necessary for growth. Perhaps someday she would learn from her mistakes and become a better leader. On the 1-year anniversary of my firing, I received a small package from Harold. Inside was a framed copy of the Ethical Management Protection Clause from my original contract, mounted alongside a quote from Edmund Burke. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing." Attached was a handwritten note from Harold. "Because of your courage to do something, our company still stands. Thank you for being the ethical compass when we needed it most." That framed clause now hangs in my office as a reminder that one person with courage really can make a difference, that systems only work when people are willing to use them, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is a single line of text that someone thought would never be needed. If my story has taught you anything today, I hope it is to stand firm in your ethics, document everything, and never underestimate the power of carefully reading the fine print. Have you ever had to stand up against workplace injustice? Drop a comment below sharing your experience. And if this story helped you in any way, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel for more real-life lessons, and share with someone who might be facing a similar situation. Remember, sometimes the clause you never expect to use becomes the very thing that saves you. Thank you for listening to my story.